Several days ago, the sun simply came to a stop in the sky.
We fool ourselves believing that peace will last.
Not every game opens with as portentous of a statement as, "The gods are dead." Then again, this is just one of numerous ways in which the Banner Saga, a just-released turn-based strategy game from newcomer developer Stoic, stands out from the crowd. Set in an original fantasy world that draws inspiration from Norse and Viking mythology, the Banner Saga is yet another seed of crowdfunded success that has finally become ripe and ready for the picking. Is the subsequent fruit a tasty treat, or has the ambitions of its developers simply rotted on the vine? The good: story, gameplay, visuals, music, replay value, multiplayer. The bad: pre-battle menu, no undo function, lack of enemy variety. The ugly: discovering the sad and horrible truth of Ivor's past. After an era of seemingly normal life in a post-gods world, everything has begun to change. The sun has stopped moving and now simply hangs frozen high in the sky. An ancient race of beings known as the Dredge, whose seeming only purpose is to flood the land with death and destruction, has returned. And out on the edges of the world, worse things from beyond myth and memory have begun to stir. Even the earth itself has started to crumble beneath the people's feet. In the wake of all this, two separate groups, one an army of hardened warriors seeking to reaffirm an old alliance, and the other a growing caravan of refugees fleeing the oncoming storm of the Dredge, head out on seemingly separate journeys that are fated to collide. For within these two groups lies perhaps the only hope left for all. The end of the world has arrived, and now all that anyone can do is try to survive. It's a heady setup for a game, and one that the Banner Saga definitely makes the most of. The game's entrancing plot and multifaceted characters help to create a complex story filled with many shades of gray. The three-man team of Stoic previously worked for BioWare, and it shows in the many difficult choices players will be confronted with throughout the game. Players will step into the shoes of a number of characters across the game's 15 to 20 hour running time, but all of them share in the kind of circumstances where the right answer is never easy to discern, assuming it even exists at all. While the Banner Saga is ultimately a linear story by design with the same beginning and end points no matter what choices players make, it's in the details and aftermath of those choices where players will be able to carve out their own version of the game's story. A big theme of the Banner Saga is the consequences of the decisions we make, and the game constantly reaffirms this. During my first playthrough, for example, one of the most memorable and surprising plot developments I encountered came about from a choice I'd made literally hours and hours previously, and had long since stopped worrying about. The end result of this choice ended up costing me the lives of several valuable members of my ragtag army, and the speed and suddenness of this entire sequence left me gasping in shock at my monitor. I was devastated by how it all played out, and yet I could not say the game had not warned me back when I made my choice. Similarly, on my second playthrough, I deliberately made different decisions at key points, and ended up with some interesting divergence in the story, especially in terms of the makeup of the forces under my command. My alternate choices also led to some characters living that had died in my first playthrough, and some dying that had lived. It was the same overall story, but my choices brought a different texture and feel to the experience, which is really all anyone can ask for when it comes to player choice in a linear, story-driven game. It also helps that said story was both unique and filled with surprises, and along similar lines, the world of the Banner Saga features just as much originality. While heavily inspired by Viking culture, the Banner Saga presents a setting with a history all its own, and populated with fantastical creations that manage to feel distinctive amidst the vast seas of fantasy fiction. The three-man team of Stoics set out to create a fantasy world that was not just, in their own words, the overdone elves, dwarves, and orcs dynamic. And with the Banner Saga, they've more than succeeded. Chief among these successes are the Varl, a race of 15-foot-tall horned giants created by the gods from a crossbreed of man and animal and incapable of reproducing on their own. Only the gods could create more Varl, and of course the gods are dead and have been for ages. Which means despite a population more than 1 million strong and possessing the ability to live for centuries, ultimately the Varl is a race already doomed to extinction. This is especially true thanks to the Varl's propensity for fighting, and indeed, no one knows the maximum lifespan of a Varl because none of them have ever managed to die of old age. They are a proud and battle-prone race whose uneasy alliance with humanity was born out of the necessity of the dredge. It's a potent backstory, and one the Banner Saga uses to generate some of the game's most memorable and engaging characters. Also, it's interesting to note that despite first impressions, the Dredge are more than just the typical fantasy boogeyman race that on first glance they might appear to be. As it turns out, these armored, stone-like beings who look like the smaller cousins of the Colossi from Shadow of the Colossus have a history and culture all their own, and very good reasons for their behavior in the game. And with a number of other races mentioned but never actually seen, it's clear that Stoic have only scratched the surface of this exotic new setting. I've already alluded to the Banner Saga's gameplay while discussing its story, and that's because the two are truly intertwined all the way down. The ideas and themes of the game are very much reflected in the gameplay as well, which in the parlance of the quick Hollywood pitch I would describe as Fire Emblem meets the Oregon Trail. Essentially, the majority of the Banner Saga's gameplay is divided between two parts: traveling and combat. The latter takes the basic turn-based strategy formula established by games like Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre and throws in some new twists that make for an exciting and engaging combat system. Unlike in Fire Emblem, a player character being defeated in combat is rarely an instant death sentence, but repeated falls in battles can lead to ongoing injuries and eventually even the dreaded last goodbye. The heart of the Banner Saga's combat system lies with each character's strength stat, which does double duty as both the basis for their ability to dish out damage and their health meter. Which means weakening a foe's strength not only brings them closer to death, but also makes them less of a threat overall. Yet this can also be turned back on the player as well, and simply sending a character with high strength out alone to take on enemies by themselves is more often than not a recipe for disaster. Characters also have an armor stat which will help protect their strength. So for example, if a character with 12 strength attacks a character with 6 armor, they can do at least 6 damage. While if a character with 7 strength attacks a character with 8 armor, they only have a 90% chance of successfully doing 1 point of damage to the latter's strength. Characters can also choose to attack another character's armor, and the amount of damage done via this attack is not based on their current level of strength. In this way, even characters with low strength or who have taken serious damage can still help contribute to victory. Finally, the game features 7 main classes that are further divided into subclasses for 16 varieties of warrior all told, and each subclass brings their own special ability to the table. These can include an archer who can shoot all enemies down a straight line, a tank who can knock enemies back and does additional damage for every character they pass through along the way, and a damage dealer who can hit multiple foes at once, to name just a few. Players can activate these abilities by spending willpower, which is a resource that can also be used to increase the movement range or damage capability of a character as well. Each character begins a fight with a pre-prescribed amount of willpower that can be refilled via a pool that gains an additional point every time an enemy is defeated. Correctly using willpower is a key to winning battles, and the amount of willpower available to players can be dramatically reduced or increased depending on the state of affairs in the traveling portion of the Banner Saga. This is the part of the game where the Oregon Trail comparison comes into play, and it works like this. A caravan of the player's current forces, which can be thousands strong beyond the 25 plus characters potentially available for direct combat duty, marches automatically along a 2D environment, either left or right, until they reach their next destination or encounter something unexpected. This traveling can take many in-game days, and players need enough supplies for each day or else face the prospect of losing members of the caravan to starvation. Furthermore, traveling too long without resting lowers morale, which in turn lowers the amount of willpower characters start with in battle. But resting also uses a whole day's worth of supplies as well. Supplies can sometimes be found or acquired via in-game events, but generally players will need to buy them at markets and towns along the way. The catch is that the in-game resource used for making these purchases, renown, is the same used to buy valuable equipment and to promote a character to the next level after they've killed enough enemies to qualify. Renown is primarily generated via combat, although in-game decisions and events can also increase or decrease a player's total as well. In addition to general combat, players will also periodically face larger scale battles, which is where the other members of the caravan beyond the playable characters come into the picture. Winning regular skirmishes during one of these clashes can help assure victory, but without a strong enough force backing them, even the most hardened squad of fighters will have difficulty winning the day. Finally, players will rarely know in advance exactly how many days of travel they have ahead of them before they reach the next market, and altogether it makes for a meaty and deep gameplay system with lots of risk-reward scenarios. None of this is to say that the Banner Saga is a perfect game, and indeed there's definitely room for improvement in future installments. For one thing, there's a distinct lack of enemy variety throughout the main campaign. That's because the Dredge remain the primary foe, and they only really come in a handful of varieties. Occasional battles with human and Varl forces do help bring something different to the table in terms of combat, but they tend to be infrequent occurrences at best. Still, the combat is in-depth enough, and the game is paced well enough that monotony never became an issue during my time with the Banner Saga. Still, more enemy types would have been appreciated. Other issues are fairly minor in nature. The game will often throw new party members at players right before a fight, for example, but the pre-battle screen does not allow for in-depth examination of the newest warrior. Also, accidentally moving a character to an unattended spot can sometimes happen, and the lack of an undo function for such an occurrence can be annoying. Still, these flaws ultimately fall away in the face of everything that the Banner Saga gets right. This is a gorgeous game with impeccable production values. The hand-drawn visuals are meant to reflect the style employed by Disney for their classic film adaptation of Sleeping Beauty, and they give the game an amazing sense of life and scope. Orally, famed composer Austin Wintory has created another soundtrack masterpiece that can easily sit on the same shelf as his previous works for that game company's journey and flow. Overall, the Banner Saga is a remarkable accomplishment and a game that no turn-based strategy fan can afford to miss. A free-to-play multiplayer version of the game titled Factions was released on Steam last April and even includes the game's opening cinematic and tutorial battle, so those still on the fence can get a taste of the full experience for no charge. Stoic are even promising that completing the Banner Saga's first chapter will allow for new unlockables in Factions. And I hope that when the game comes to consoles later this year, it will include Factions because it's an enjoyable way of battling one's friends. As I've already established, the Banner Saga is only the first chapter of a larger trilogy, and the game's ending reflects that. This is not a standalone experience in the same way that the first Star Wars or Mass Effect were, although the game does at least end on a suitably climactic encounter. Still, if this is all we ever get of the Banner Saga, I know I for one would be disappointed, yet I'm not overly concerned about that happening. Put simply, this is a game that's going to turn some heads, and not just because of its amazing visuals either. Stoic's new spin on a familiar genre is a potent experiment that ultimately wildly succeeds as a compelling video game experience. Fans of last year's Fire Emblem Awakening in particular should take note, because your new fix has arrived. The Banner Saga may herald the end of a world, but those who play it will, in the words of the immortal sage, end up feeling fine. Score: 9 out of 10 must own. Recommendation: buy it now.